We've been spending some time speaking about the kingdom of God, and as I mentioned this morning, today, this afternoon, rather than be in the book of Judges as we normally are, I just had a lot of other comments to make, specifically about the nature and history of Jerusalem. And it's significant to kind of say it that way because the existence of Jerusalem is the heart of the nation of Israel. So there's a lot of times in the prophets where they speak of Zion or Mount Zion or Jerusalem. Those are all interchangeable, really as a type of the whole nation. So to speak of Jerusalem is to speak of the state of the whole nation. So that is an important theme. This morning we talked about the kingdom being restored to Israel and how that is going to come after a period of judgment and wars and fighting and so on. And one of the identifying characteristics of the time between the resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ till now, or till actually the time when the kingdom will be restored, future to us, is that Gentiles, non-Israelites, non-Jews, people not of the nation of Israel, will be brought into and become citizens of this kingdom of God. And I wanted to get a little bit more specific about that and just kind of get a little history of Jerusalem, because what happens there and what has happened there is significant prophetically, and it's fulfillment of prophecy as well. So just brief history. I'm going to try and make it brief history. That's more or less what today is going to be about. But David, King David, he ruled from Jerusalem. It was kind of his hometown, to the point where another name for Jerusalem is the city of David. So Jerusalem becomes the capital of Israel at the time of David for those reasons. Before that, they're really just another city that was occupied by the Jebusites, was supposed to be, the Jebusites are supposed to be driven out, just like all the other nations, when the Israelites came in at the time of Joshua and they were conquering the land. Like the Jebusites in Jerusalem, they're just supposed to be another group of people that were to be kicked out of the land or killed from the land. But they didn't do necessarily a great job of that. The Jebusites ended up fighting with Israel for years, hundreds of years, and David finally conquered it, and it was the capital. That's the moment. That's about 1000 BC. So just putting round numbers on it, let's say 3,000 years ago was the rule of David, and Jerusalem was the capital. Now, after the death of David, his son Solomon became king. You remember that? And he also ruled from Jerusalem. This was the height of Israel's power and influence in the world. He had great riches and prosperity. Times were very, very good. And there's a sense in which this was almost the fulfillment of what God had intended Israel to be, this bright, shining hill, a city on a hill that would be like a lighthouse to the nations, saying, this is where the glory of God dwells. This is what it means to be the people of God. But we also know Solomon was the kind of guy to have 1,000 wives and concubines. He's also the sort of person to try and find pleasure in so many different avenues, such that he wrote an entire book called Ecclesiastes describing how vain it was to try and find satisfaction outside of God. And unfortunately, after him, we have this split of the kingdom. Referenced that this morning. He had two kingdoms, the kingdom of Judah in the south, the kingdom of Israel in the north, 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin. And the capital of the northern kingdom was Samaria, and the capital of the southern kingdom was Jerusalem. The southern kingdom was, in a sense, the true heart of Israel. The northern kingdom had nothing but wicked kings, nothing but idolatry, nothing but foolishness, and in 722 BC, they were judged by the Assyrians. When you read a lot of the prophets that are referencing the northern kingdom, it's all judgment, and it has this sense of Assyria is coming to bring judgment against you. So a lot of the judgment passages of the Old Testament in reference to Israel context is Assyria. Those Jews were scattered, 10 tribes of them were scattered out into the world, and they still are to this day. Sometimes they're referred to as the lost tribes of Israel. So if you ever heard that phrase, that's what it refers to. So that was, 2,700 years ago. The southern kingdom of Judah, where the tribe of kings were to come from, the tribe of Judah, they also fell into wickedness and sin. Of course, you know this. They were conquered in 586 by the Babylonians. They come in and they come to Jerusalem. They lay a siege against it. We know very clearly that this happened at this time. There's lots of records of this. They siege Jerusalem. They destroy it. They destroy the temple. They destroy the walls. They completely sack it. And from that moment on, you could say, there has never been a throne in Israel for a king to sit on. From that moment on, 586, you could say then, is the moment when the kingdom was lost. It's about 2,600 years ago. Jerusalem, from that point, was no longer a city of its own. It was no longer a city that was truly under the control of the Israelites. From that moment on, 586 BC, when the Jewish people are allowed to return under Persian rule, the Persians who conquered the Babylonians, the Persians say, you can go back. We'll let you go back. We'll let you rebuild the city. We'll let you rebuild the temple. But it's all under the auspices and the rule of the Persian Empire. It's not as an independent thing. They're not allowed to recreate their civilization. They're not allowed to have an independent king and an independent kingdom. Jerusalem exchanged many hands over those centuries. So that happens, let's say, around 500 BC. And from 500 BC to, 0, right? 0 AD, 0 BC, approximately. Again, Jesus was probably born like 6 or 7 BC. BC meaning before Christ. So Jesus was born before Christ. I know. It's just people, they didn't math very well when they made these dates. But the Jerusalem ended up passing through many hands. Babylonians to the Persians, Persians to the Greeks to the Romans, and at no point in any of that was the land theirs. Were the people independent? Was there a throne in Jerusalem where a king could sit on? And at no point was there ever a true king that even claimed the throne. We talked about Herod the Great. He was called the King of the Jews. Was not even Jewish, okay? It was a title that the Romans said, you can have this if you can keep this territory under some kind of control. We'll give you the title, but he did not earn the title, certainly did not deserve the title, hardly even qualified to be a king or even a Jew. When Jesus came preaching and teaching, he is the King of the Jews. And the kingdom, for a moment, was being presented to the people. Israel was face to face with King God in their midst. And he is the one that is going to bring the kingdom. We saw that this morning, but all throughout the prophetic passages, what was the idea? That when the king comes, he will bring in the kingdom. He will subdue the nations. He will bring the kingdom. So what they're waiting for is not necessarily a reestablishment of a national Israel or full independence. What they should have been waiting for is the king, the coming of the king. But they were a little confused because at the first coming of the king, Jesus came to be rejected by his people in order to save his people. It's completely upside down. We've mentioned this many times before. This is an upside down kingdom where the king would serve and sacrifice for his people, not the other way around. So they were expecting when the king comes, he will establish a kingdom. Jesus in his first coming, he comes, but not to establish this kingdom. They reject him. And through that, again, we have this period where we are, the Gentiles, able to be incorporated into this kingdom. There's a sense in which they lost the kingdom in 586 BC. There's another sense that they lost the kingdom there when they rejected Jesus Christ, their king. And I want to remind you of these words. I think we read them this morning in Luke 21. Jesus himself would prophesy that it's not that the prophecies were untrue in the Old Testament, that the king would come and establish his kingdom. They were right and correct and accurate. It's just that it wasn't at this coming that this would happen, but at the next coming or the second coming of the king that the kingdom would be established. And we see these words after after prophesying of many events and tribulations and trials. He says, we'll start in verse 20, Luke 21:20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, after that, he's going to talk about some cosmic indications of the coming of the Son of Man, which have not happened. But we see here in verses 20 through 24 a very specific prophecy of a siege against Jerusalem that will result in Jerusalem being trampled underfoot by Gentiles, but also for Gentiles. It's a very important statement here that Jerusalem is going to be trampled underfoot by Gentiles, but until the time the Gentiles are fulfilled, but really that means for Gentiles, for the sake of Gentiles being included in the kingdom. We talked about that already, but we know that is the sense here. Even if Jesus doesn't say that explicitly here, we know that it's expanded on by Paul and others to indicate that. And this is what happens. The Jewish people and the land were still identified as Jewish, although they were under the authority of the Roman Empire. They had Jewish leadership even up until this point, right? So there was different governors, Jewish governors, and even kings set up all under Pilate's authority, so to speak. But that didn't last long. Around 68 AD. So 68 AD, the Romans decided they wanted to start taking some of the temple funds for themselves. This caused a riot. There had already been rebellions prior to this. Excuse me. But this was almost like too much when the Romans started trying to take the temple money. And so there was a series of resistance and rebellion, and the first Jewish-Roman war. Excuse me. I think I might need a little bit more. Cough drop might help, actually. It's like a piece of dust just suddenly lodged itself in my throat. Thanks. I owe you. What happened? Thought I was doing so good. All right. Okay. So, on August 30th, 70 AD, the Romans, after a 5-month siege of Jerusalem, set fire to the temple and destroyed the temple and subdued Jerusalem. The words that Jesus had spoken about the destruction of the temple had come to pass, both in Luke 21 here and Matthew 24. It was just 40 years prior that the disciples and Jesus on the Mount of Olives were looking at the temple and saying how marvelous it was. In this moment, it effectively marked the end of the political power of the Jewish people in that land for thousands of years. Thousands of years. Furthermore, it's ironic. The temple had just finished being remodeled 4 years before this. Remember Herod the Great? He took the temple that was built by Solomon, and not built by Solomon. Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. The Jews, under the power of the empire of Persia, they rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. So the second temple, Herod, it stood for hundreds of years. Herod refurbished it. It was a great project of his. He's the one that had made it beautiful. He died, but the project maintained 66 AD, finally finished, and then 4 years later, it was destroyed right after. And as if to point out that this was no mere coincidence, the day on which the temple was set on fire was the 9th day of the month of Av, or Tisha B'Av. And it seems to be, now there's a little bit of dispute whether it's exactly the day, but so almost to the day in 586 BC when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. So it seems that on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is the name of one of the months in the Jewish calendar, that both temples were destroyed. And so to this day, Tisha B'Av is the saddest day of the Jewish calendar. It's a day of fasting and mourning and so on. Now, the area of land which had this, Jewish political control under the Roman Empire, it was renamed Palestina around 135 AD by the Romans. It possibly coincides with the Romans squashing another Jewish rebellion. And it's perhaps that they wanted to completely remove any Jewish kind of tie or relationship to that land, so they renamed it Palestina, or Palestine. Now, this had been a word used to describe that area of the Philistines. And if you hear it, if you just change the F to a P, right? Palestine and Philistine, they're related words. That used to refer just to a certain part of the coast where the Philistines lived. It's actually the part now which would be considered the Gaza Strip, which we'll talk about in a second. But it used to be that would be called Palestine for the Philistines, or the Philistines. You can hear the similarity, just change the F to the P. But they kind of brought the name back in order to, again, probably to get any kind of Jewishness out of it. Prior to that, it was called Judea because of Judah, because of the Jews. So this is about 135 AD that the Romans renamed that territory to Palestine, basically. And that name was used for that whole region on into the Byzantine period, which is, say, late 300 AD to about 600 AD. So that's the late Roman and Byzantine Empire. What happened in around 600 AD? The rise of Islam. The Muslims started to have a lot of power militarily, politically, and they started to spread, and they eventually got to Jerusalem, and they conquered it. And in 691 AD, so that's about 1,300 years ago, they built the Dome of the Rock on the same place where the temple once stood, and the Dome of the Rock was built to memorialize the spot where the Muslim prophet Muhammad was said to have ascended to heaven. You can go today, 1,300 years later, and see the Dome of the Rock. I have seen it in person there on the Temple Mount. For hundreds of years after that, the Muslims were in control of Jerusalem. Now, there'd be different factions of Muslims fighting, but they were in control of it. And so something called the Crusades were begun, mainly by Western European Christians in 1099, or around the 1000 AD marker. All right, so if you ever heard of the Crusades, it was a response to the rising Muslim influence, especially their control of Jerusalem. And there's a lot of politicking behind it. Trust me, it wasn't just some completely Christian endeavor, but on paper it was, how can we let Jerusalem fall into the hands or remain in the hands of pagans, of those who are not Christian or Jewish or anything, of the Muslims. So they led these crusades. In 1099, they captured Jerusalem. The Crusaders captured Jerusalem. They held it for 88 years before Saladin led the Muslims to recapture it. And for the most part, Jerusalem was under Muslim control for hundreds more years. So except for that 88-year period, really, from about 600 AD to about, to about 1948, okay, it was under Muslim control, for the most part, or Muslim influence. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So, hundreds of years passed, so we're 1099, for 88 years, the Crusaders had it. After that, Muslims. They had it for hundreds of years. And then in 1517, the Ottoman Empire, which was a Turkish Muslim empire, they gained control of Jerusalem. Again, you had a lot of different, warring empires and factions coming through, mostly Muslim. And so the Ottoman Empire rose to power 1517 AD. And again, this land is called Palestine. It's just been carried over from the Roman era. The Muslims called it a variation of Palestine. It just fit in. No one really changed it. And on Tisha B'Av, 1914, the Germans started World War I. 1914. So Ottoman Empire, 1517, about 400 years later, World War I starts. Now the Ottomans and the Turks, they aligned with the Germans and what we call the Axis parties. From our point of view, they were the bad guys. Now, they would say that the Allies were the bad guys. I think a lot of bad people in World War I. But let's just say that the Germans and the Ottomans, they were aligned in this war. It's supposed to be the war to end all wars, World War I. And the British, who were on the Allied side, in 1917, the British and the Ottomans fought in the Battle of Jerusalem. And the British defeated the Ottomans. They gained control over Jerusalem, breaking centuries of Muslim rule over the city. So the British and the Allies defeated the Axis powers. Jerusalem, Palestine, was under the control of the British. It was called the Palestinian Mandate or Mandatory Palestine. It was under British control for a few more decades. Because, what's better than one world war? It's two world wars. What's better than the war to end all wars? It's the next war to end all wars. And World War II breaks out. On Tisha B'Av, 1942, the Jews in the Polish Warsaw ghettos were packed into rail cars and sent to Treblinka, a death camp, where 870,000 Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Now, it's probably not coincidence. There's not necessarily explicit data that they chose this day out of psychological warfare, but knowing the Nazis, they wanted to pick a day that was the worst day and just say, this is a day we're going to round everyone up and we're going to send them to Treblinka, which was second only to Auschwitz in terms of the camps that were created to exterminate the Jewish people, and the final solution. And by some estimates, even the final solution was approved by the Nazi Party a year before on Tisha B'Av, but that may not have as much data behind it. But in any case, after World War II had ended, it became clear what had happened during the Holocaust under the Nazi regime. 6 million Jews murdered, countless other Jews scattered refugees. Of course, others were killed besides Jews, but for the most part, it was Jewish people who were killed by the Nazis. And it was ultimately decided, there's a lot of politicking and the UN saying this and the British doing that, but ultimately it was decided that the Palestinian mandate would end and a Jewish state would be allowed in 1948. So World War II ends in 1945 for 3 years as the horrors of the Holocaust are unfolding. There becomes a political movement to allow for Israel, for the Jewish people to return to Palestine. And as soon as they were allowed to do that, Israel formed a Jewish state, an independent nation was formed, a safe haven for Jews from around the world. It wasn't the whole land, and that at that point they renamed it from a region, this region is called Palestine, to the name of a nation, Israel, restoring that verbiage from the Bible. But of course, it's not the whole land. It was not a theocracy where they submitted to the scriptures. There's no temple or throne or king, just a national identity. But perhaps more importantly, the Jewish people were in the land and at Jerusalem. Now, ironically, there were some Jews in 1948 who thought, this is it. We've had all the wars of the nations, right? We talked about in Zechariah 14, Isaiah and Joel and all those passages, right, about this morning, about how the nations were coming against Jerusalem, and the king would come and subdue the enemies, and Israel would be restored. And some of them thought, this is it. But they had to spiritualize things. Says, where's the king? All those passages, there's a king that's going to sit and rule from Jerusalem. God is our king. We don't need any king but God. They had to spiritualize it. They twisted it. This was not Zechariah 14, because you know what Zechariah 14 also said, as we read this morning, is that the nations would come and worship. That Jerusalem would be, say, the pinnacle of the kingdoms of the earth. And the king would punish those who don't come to celebrate the Feast of Booths in Zechariah 14. Did that happen? No. This is very wishful thinking by the Jewish people. Not only that, immediately after the creation of the state or of Israel, which America almost immediately acknowledged, there was a war, sometimes called the first Arab Jewish War. Can call it the War for Independence. 1948, almost immediately after being declared a state, an Arab coalition fought against this birthing Israel, almost as if to try and kill it in the womb. And so you had this coalition of almost all the nations around Israel fight against the Jewish people, and somehow, miraculously, it is a miracle. If you hear the testimonies, they miraculously emerged victorious, cementing the identity, national identity of Israel with Jerusalem as its capital. That was 1948. 1967. So when we talk about the Gentiles will trample Jerusalem underfoot, we've seen that. Up until 1948, Gentiles trampling, right, Jerusalem underfoot for 2,000 years almost. Now we see these conditions where there's no peace. We know that when national Israel restored, is this Zechariah 14? Is this Isaiah 65? Is this all those passages we read this morning? No, because look at all the war that happened since then. 1967, the Six-Day War. Arab nations of Syria, Jordan, Egypt, they once again attack Israel. Israel completely dominates these nations. Again, it's a miraculous victory because it was somewhat of a surprise attack was supposed to be. They captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and eastern Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. So this was as big as modern nation of Israel has ever gotten. Was after the Six-Day War. They got everything. It was such a resounding victory that they accomplished there. Well, the Egyptians and the Syrians were not too happy about that. So in 1973, They launched a war on Yom Kippur. It's the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement. So this is the day where in the Old Testament, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies in the temple, offer sacrifices. There's no temple, but it's still considered a very holy day. In the Jewish calendar, it's holiest day. It's supposed to be a day of rest, mourning, all these things. And Egypt and Syria, they attack, again, trying to regain their lost territory. They make a few gains and then immediately lose it again because it seems like Israel has some divine hand behind it. The Camp David Accords, which is led by U.S., signed in 1978, eventually gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. So if you don't know what the Sinai Peninsula, it's that kind of like V-shaped looking land that is next to Egypt and between Israel. There's not a whole lot going on there. It's pretty desolate, actually. So that's actually the wilderness. When they were wandering in the wilderness, they were wandering in that peninsula. So kind of, there's some beachfront property there, but it's also pretty chaotic. I mean, it's not a nice place, really. It's not. There's in the southern part of it where kind of the Red Sea and the other Gulf of Cauda meet. There's some towns there, but it's kind of desolate. It's a wilderness. It's where Israel was lost. But okay, you can have it back. I was thinking we didn't really want it anyway, so you can have it back. It's kind of a hassle to defend. Syria tried to get the Golan Heights back, and Israel said no. And this is still disputed. In the late 80s and early 90s, and now this is times where you may remember some of this, and I'll talk about something later in a second where I have very clear memories, but late 80s, early 90s, you had the first intifada of the Palestinians. Palestinian, that name, it refers to Arabs living in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank of Israel. You can look on a map and find that, but in those two places, there's a lot of Arabs who live there. Gaza Strip is kind of classic Palestine, or the land of the Philistines, and the West Bank. And the Arabs living there, using guerrilla warfare and guerrilla tactics, they rebelled, and they created such a conflict with Israel that you had the Oslo Accords, which of course was signed in Oslo in the 90s, and that allowed the Palestinian Authority to govern the Gaza Strip and parts of the West Bank. That was in the 90s. This kind of process happened in the 90s. So Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and said, Palestinian Authority, PA, you can be in charge here. Just stop it with the terrorist stuff. Well, seeing as how that worked, there was a second intifada in the early 2000s. Now, this one I clearly remember because that's when I started coming to ICC. That's when I started going to Hadavar classes, which were led by Bob Morris, who's a Messianic Jew. That's when I started every day at UCI checking the news about what was happening in Israel and seeing the videos of these terrorist attacks, of children being taught to become suicide bombers, all right? Horrific stuff. And then I went to Israel in September of 2002, in kind of the middle of this second intifada. I was about to graduate, and so my mom asked me, what do you want as a graduation gift? I was thinking, places to go, Europe or something. I said, you got to go to Israel. I mean, if your mom's paying for a trip to anywhere, you should go to Israel. Well, it's like a super dangerous time, so they're itching for tourists. No, you'll be safe. No one was there. It was barren. Very few visitors. My tour group was 2 South American ladies, and that was it. And my tour guide could speak Spanish, English, Arabic, and Hebrew. So, it was, very multilingual. So, he wasn't a believer, though. He got us into some of these areas that were under Palestinian control, because at that time, it was kind of a no-no. So, Bethlehem, Palestinian control. Well, he knew some people. So, we got to go to the church. There's a church in Bethlehem, of course, built over the site where Jesus was supposedly born. And I remember going there, and no one was there. There's Palestinian kids playing in this church. There's bullet holes all around the outside of the church in Bethlehem. And I remember it was because it was shortly before that, there was sort of a siege where some of the Palestinians had holed up in the church in Bethlehem. Bullet holes everywhere. Surreal experience. You'd go to Jerusalem, and the gates are riddled with bullet holes because of all the wars that have happened there over the years. I happened to be there, and I timed it this way, to be at the Western Wall, or to be in Israel during Yom Kippur. Again, Day of Atonement, holiest day of the year. Usually, people are the holiest site in Jerusalem, and for Jews right now, is the Western Wall. It's as close as they can get, really, to the temple, or being kind of feeling close to the temple. Usually it's packed during Yom Kippur. You can hardly squeeze your way in. I was there right up next to the wall. There's barely anyone there. It did not occur to me until I was thinking about this, like, you know why they weren't there? It's because they were worried about a terrorist attack on Yom Kippur at the holiest site in Judaism, and you were there, this goofy goober, just, there like a tourist. And I remember, like, I was joking around with people back here. It's like, hey, let me know if you got any prayer requests. I'm going to be a little bit closer to God, because I'll be at the Western Wall on Yom Kippur. So you just let me know if there's any special prayer requests you have. It's kind of a joke. But I was there. But how foolhardy was that to be in that location? This is 2002. And, that intifada was still going on because the Palestinians wanted more. And I'm not trying to justify anything the Israeli government has done or not done, but they found this was a tactic that that would work. Since then, Hezbollah, a terrorist organization in Lebanon, and Hamas, a terrorist organization that forms the government of Gaza, has been fighting with Israel almost nonstop, primarily through launching rockets indiscriminately into Israel, which resulted in the creation of what's called the Iron Dome, Israel's anti-missile system. But there's also been, since then, anti-Semitic attacks globally since the 2000s, 20 years ago. And of course, on October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a terrorist attack on concert-goers. They killed 1,139 Israelis and took about 250 hostages. Now, let's put this in a little bit of context. On 9/11, 2,977 were killed between the World Trade Centers, the Pentagon, and so on. Most of those, of course, were at the World Trade Centers. We lost 2,753. Tragically, 343 of that. 343 of that were firefighters, of course, trying to rescue and save people. Now, at that time, America had a population of about 285 million people. Israel's population last year was about 9.7 million, with 7.1 million of that being Jews, okay? In other words, proportionally, America with 285 million losing, almost 3,000 people, for the Jewish people to have killed in a terrorist attack 1,000, but their population is about 7 million, it would be as if on 9/11 we lost 120,000 people. I mean, that, kind of proportionally, right? So that's the way they view it. Jewish people view it like that. They don't view it like, 1,000. Well, we lost a third of that. It's not even a World Trade Center kind of attack. Well, proportionally, it'd be more like if there's a terrorist attack here that killed 120,000 people. Clearly, all that to say, this little bit of history, is that 1948 was not the fulfillment of Zechariah 14 or Isaiah 65 or any of the prophetic passages that we read and talked about this morning. Modern state of Israel is a miracle. It's like watching the seed of a plant that was thought to be extinct, sprouting from a heap of ashes. It's a marvel, and it's a precondition for the circumstances of the restoration of the kingdom. Why? Because in all of the passages that we saw, we do see Jerusalem, right? And there's Jewish people in Jerusalem. And that implies some kind of condition where Jewish people have some kind of power, influence, or control over Jerusalem in those passages. So we do care in the sense that the time of the Gentiles, which is characterized by Jerusalem being trampled underfoot by Gentiles, that maybe coming to a close, because as of now, Jerusalem, well, this is what's interesting. Jerusalem's technically wholly controlled territorially by Israel, but portions of it, politically, geopolitically, they are not necessarily allowed to exercise total control. For example, there's a reason the Dome of the Rock is still sitting on top of the Temple Mount. It's not because the Jewish people want it there, but because politically, they don't have total control over Jerusalem. Now, I won't get too much into it today, but I am under the belief that at some point there will be a temple built on there. And for that to happen, the Jewish people will have to have total control over Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. And so what I would think is going to happen at some point in the future to fulfill these prophecies is a control of Jerusalem by the Jewish people somehow, some way. And you can talk about Antichrist and all this stuff, and I think there's a way to make that gel together. But the reason we care about this, again, is because Jerusalem, more than maybe a national Israel, it's the idea that there is a Jerusalem that is somehow still under the political power of Jewish people, which is almost the case today. But for now, modern Israel is still in defiant unbelief that the Old Testament ended with. The same unbelief that caused Jesus to be killed, the same persecution that Paul suffered as the Jewish people, whom he wished he could give almost his own salvation for, and yet they rejected, that John the Apostle prophesied in the final book of the New Testament Revelation, Israel's still in a state of unbelief. But I will say the existence of Israel now is a reminder that God is not done yet. Yes, they have been and are under prophetic judgment, as they have been for thousands of years. But remember, it's for the sake of the Gentiles, hearing about the kingdom and being brought into it. But one day, someday, maybe soon, their restoration will come. Isaiah 53 is considered, we'll close with this, the forbidden chapter, in a way, to the Jews. In fact, if you read Isaiah 53 to many Jewish people without giving them a context of it, just say, this comes from the Bible, tell me what you think, and you read Isaiah 53, they will immediately assume it comes from the New Testament, because it speaks so clearly of the Messiah. He was despised and rejected by men, man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and Yahweh has laid on him the iniquity of us all. They'll see, that's obviously talking about Jesus. If you don't tell them it's from Isaiah 53, tell them, no, this is from your prophet. Isaiah blows their mind. I bring this up because this is presented as the recognition of a restored Israel looking at the first coming of Christ and realizing that they rejected him. In other words, this passage is kind of from the perspective of this restored Israel looking back and saying, we esteemed him not. We thought that he was rejected by God, but instead he was the one that was rejected for us. They're going to realize, restored Israel is going to realize what they had done to Jesus, and Isaiah 53 is kind of capturing that point of view. We still care about the Jewish people. We still care about national Israel, not because who they are right now is who they are going to be, but because they are markers on the way. Just as Jesus said, look to these markers because these signify my coming. They're a reminder that God is going to keep his promise, that one day they will realize and recognize their Messiah. There needs to be something in us that delights to think of the moment when Israel, who rejected their king, and through it we got to become partners in this kingdom with them, there has to be something in us that says, and when they finally figure it out and see it, how glorious will that be? It's like seeing people reunited that have been at odds. You know, if you've ever been in a situation where these family members are kind of, against each other, and then seeing them reconcile, and it just, you just feel so good to see it happening. You knew it was going to happen. You knew it was just a misunderstanding. You knew that these are people you love, and that moment of reunion is, it just feels so good. This is like the ultimate reunion of that. That's how we should view it as Gentiles. That's why we care about what's going on and what will happen. Again, it's, we can get into the politics and all those things. It's not like a Christian needs to support every policy and politic of a essentially secular Israeli government, but we do care about the gospel. We do care about Jerusalem because that's where our king will reign. Our king is going to reign in Jerusalem. So we care about these things as a signpost and a marker on the way. Now, if you have any questions about that, you let me know, but I will make this claim to you, if you're not a Christian this afternoon or listening to this, that the Bible is talking about reality, and it's explaining how we got where we are on a global geopolitical level, but it's also talking about you and your story and the things that have happened in your life. That this story that incorporates kings and the rise and fall of nations is also the book and the story that includes your life, who your parents were, the kinds of things you've experienced, your own hardships and hurts. And God says, I had a plan and purpose for all of that too. It's for you to know me, just as it's for Israel to know their God, just as it's for Gentiles to be welcomed into the kingdom. So it is, if you're not a Christian today, there's a plan God has for you to know him through this Christ, who's the king of a kingdom that will never end. I hope your hope is not in politics or any person of this world or anything, because people are corruptible and sinful. The things of this world can rust and be stolen, but God and his kingdom is forever and ever. So if you have any questions about that, how to be a part of that kingdom, I'd love to talk to you. If you are a Christian this afternoon, again, I hope this gets you excited and invested and interested. This is the plan. This is the explanation. This is the story beginning to end. It's all here laid out for us. We have a lot of answers, and I hope that excites you. I hope that makes you anticipate what is coming next and what God will do, and I hope that makes you eager to want to share about the goodness of this King and the gospel, who's coming to make everything right. But woe to you if you're not right with him when he comes. And so let us be all the more vigilant and ready and purposeful until our King returns.